Next up, we have apparently the villainous Bultmann defender, from what I've gathered. Uh, David Congdon of University of Kansas, Eadem Sunt Omnia Semper, C.S. Lewis among the Modern Theologians.
Well, I am neither a Orthodox nor a biblical scholar, but I appreciate Leslie for inviting me on this panel. I initially rejected the invitation, but I'm grateful that you convinced me to do it. So 10 years ago, Leslie emailed me after we had interacted on Twitter to ask if I would review her paper on C.S. Lewis and Rudolf Bultmann for that year's SBL conference. I knew then that this book would be something special, and that was confirmed 2 years ago when I first read some of her chapter drafts. It's an honor to be on this panel to celebrate her achievement, especially since it brings my own academic career full circle. As a student at Wheaton College, I worked at the Marion E. Wade Center, the special collections for the Inklings, and I was there right when it opened, really. That was the first year it opened. I was the editorial assistant for the Journal 7, which we got mentioned there. I was a research assistant for Wayne Martindale, and I studied Lewis on a summer Wheaton trip to Oxford, where I got to know Walter Hooper, who briefly tried to recruit me to be his successor at the Kilns. Martindale took me aside privately to tell me to stick with my academic plans, but now I wonder if I should have taken him up on the offer. After Wheaton, I left my interest in Lewis behind and went to Princeton Seminary, where I eventually did my doctoral work on Rudolf Bultmann, focusing especially on his program of demythologizing. But I finally returned to Lewis in my recent book, Who Was a True Christian, where I spent part of a chapter examining mere Christianity. So here I kind of want to bring all of this together in a short period of time. So I want to begin naturally by taking a look at Leslie's chapter on Lewis and Bultmann, which has its origins in that SBL paper from a decade ago. It's an excellent chapter, and I'm not just saying that because Leslie calls me Bultmann's best contemporary expositor. Very kind of her. But compared to almost anything written on Bultmann in recent years, this chapter takes a far more appreciative tone toward the German scholar. Nevertheless, I want to press Leslie, as well as others who are less sympathetic, Jason and others, on the comparison between Lewis and Bultmann. From this starting point, we will be in a position, I hope, to grasp the larger claim I want to make about Lewis's relationship with modernity. So let's start with Bultmann's concept of myth. So Leslie quotes my early work where I say that Bultmann mostly failed, quote unquote, in his effort to clarify the meaning of myth. But Leslie has read my statement as if I agree with it, and in fact, I do not. The crucial qualifying phrase from my book is, quote, if the confusing and contradictory statements made by both his contemporaries and later scholars are any indication, unquote. Now, in other words, I was saying that Bultmann failed to clarify myth if we take as our guide the scholarly discussion about Bultmann. But as I go on to claim, scholars have simply done a very poor job of reading Bultmann. So I'm unable to fully agree with Leslie here when she says that Bultmann misses the mark in defining his terms. So what is Bultmann's definition? Citing an essay of mine, Leslie says that Bultmann, this is a quote from the book, Bultmann holds several different ideas about myth together in tension, describing it both as the world picture, Weltbild, of an ancient culture and as an objectifying mode of thinking. Now, this may be a fault of my own work, it certainly probably is, but it was a goal of my first book to argue, in contrast to that view, that Bultmann does not hold competing views in tension, but rather develops what I call a composite definition of myth. As I wrote in the essay that she cites, we can therefore define myth as an objectifying thinking within an ancient and foreign world picture. These are not competing views, but rather two essential parts of a single definition. Bultmann then constructs his definition of demythologizing to address each of those parts. So as he wrote in 1952, negatively, demythologizing is criticism of the mythical world picture. Positively, demythologizing is existentialist interpretation. I've unpacked all of that in my own work. I'm not going to belabor that here. But what I want to point out here is that the most important piece of this definition of myth is the concept of world picture, not the part about objectifying thinking. And we know that to be the case because Bultmann elsewhere criticizes science for being a form of objectifying thinking. In fact, in one of the earliest theological writings back in the 1920s, he criticizes theology itself for its objectification of God and argues that the goal of genuine theology is not to speak about God, but rather to speak of God by pointing toward that which we are unable to capture in language. But Bultmann does not think modern theology is myth, even if it deserves critique. And why not? Because myth for him names a specific historical and cultural context. And reducing myth to objectifying thinking for God has led many scholars to think that demythologizing requires abandoning any talk of God as mythical. Yeah, and this puts us in the same quandary that so many scholars have found themselves over the years, who think that Bultmann's defense of language about divine action is nonsensical or contradictory on his own terms. Leslie, for very understandable reasons, focuses almost exclusively on the objectifying aspect of myth, largely because I think it makes for a better comparison with Lewis. Since for Lewis, objectifying thinking is closer to what Lewis means by myth. It's a way of speaking about the divine and the transcendent. Lewis is a scholar of literature, and he comes to myth by way of literary studies. Bultmann is a historian, and that makes all the difference. So I want to suggest here that Lewis does not have a category of myth at all, at least in the sense that Bultmann defines that term. Now I want to look at some of the evidence here. I'm drawing this from Leslie's incredible chapter on this. I'm just going to summarize some of the key points, but these come out in the chapter. Myth for Lewis is metaphorical language that mediates between abstract thought and concrete experience. Myth is the natural point of contact between humanity and God. Myth is eternal and abiding. Myth gives life. What all of these notions of myth share is timelessness. Myth here is a structural feature of human existence. It is part of the created order that makes it possible for humans to receive the divine. And in the case of the true myth of incarnation, myth is the actual reception of the divine into the world. Lewis has absolutely no sense for what Bultmann means by myth, a historically and culturally situated way of thinking and experiencing the world that is, by definition, not universalizable. Whether we call that myth or something else is secondary. The question is whether Lewis acknowledges cultural discontinuity that makes mutual understanding between different cultures extraordinarily difficult, requiring the practice of hermeneutics. It is not clear to me that Lewis has any sense of the hermeneutical. For him, there are myths, which are timeless structures of metaphor and mediation, and there are facts, which are timeless objects of truth that all people at all times can recognize and acknowledge. To show you Lewis's lack of sense for the historical, consider his 1955 inaugural lecture for Cambridge University, published as De Descriptione Temporum. In this lecture, Lewis sets out to provide a periodization of literary and cultural history from antiquity to the present day. No small task. He begins by stating that previous historical breaks, such as between antiquity and the Middle Ages, or between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, are ultimately of little to no consequence. The only historical break that he considers to be genuinely real and important is the one that took place sometime between 1800 and 1900, between the life of Jane Austen and his own. This is from here. He says that the Western world prior to Austen is characterized by homogeneity, which is separated from the present world by a chasm as a result of political, artistic, religious, and technological changes. Perhaps most remarkably of all, he then ends the lecture by saying he is a native of Austen's world, what he calls, quote, old Western culture, unquote. And he speaks to students today who belong on the other side of that chasm from him. In other words, he truly believes himself to be closer in culture and thought to Homer and St. Paul than to those punk-ass kids born in the 1930s. Perhaps this is why, for Lewis, all talk of the ancient past as alien comes across to him as chronological snobbery. He cannot fathom any other reason why someone like Bultmann would say such a thing. Anyone who has actually read Bultmann, of course, would know how much he actually loves the ancient past. Bultmann would have gladly spent all of his days reading the Greek and Latin classics rather than engaging in modern thought. So Bultmann is hardly dismissive of antiquity. But Bultmann recognizes that, as historians often like to say, the past is a foreign country. And there is indeed a chasm between yesterday and today from which no one, including Lewis, is exempt. And it is the task of interpretation to constantly bridge that chasm, hence the program of demythologizing. As I've argued in my work, Bultmann's demythologizing is ultimately rooted in a theological claim about the doctrine of justification by grace and faith alone, and specifically in the interpretation of that doctrine put forward by the dialectical school of Karl Barth, according to which there is no natural capacity for God, and it is God who graciously speaks to humanity and makes it possible to respond to that divine word. Lewis, as I've already intimated, does not share that theology, but rather has a robust account of natural theology, as we've heard, and the natural capacity of all humans to know God. Myth, I would argue, is one of the many forms that this natural capacity takes in Lewis's work, and that is why it must be a timeless feature of existence. For this reason, the Bultmannian counterpart to Lewis's concept of myth either does not exist at all because of a theological difference between them, or rather it corresponds instead to Bultmann's concept of the kerygma, which is the divine word itself that reaches out to humanity and compels the human person to respond. In other words, it won't work to compare Lewis and Bultmann on the concept of myth as if they are talking about the same thing. They really aren't. Instead, we need to compare Lewis's myth with Bultmann's kerygma, both of which are, I propose, ways of talking about the essence of Christianity, namely whatever it is that binds Christians together across time and place. Parenthetically here, we get closer to Bultmann's concept of myth when we look at Lewis's concept of the term folk tale, from God in the Dock, or saga in The Four Loves, but that's a topic for another time. We're now in a position to see how Lewis and Bultmann are engaged in similar projects. I want to suggest that both are attempting to make Christianity meaningful in the modern world. This agenda is explicit in the case of Bultmann, but it stands in contrast to Lewis's surface claims. And in my recent book, Who is a True Christian, I place Lewis in a modern intellectual tradition that includes John Henry Newman and Adolf von Harnack. These and other theologians were addressing a crisis posed by modernity, whether they recognized it or not. That crisis took a number of different forms, including the problem of diversity and dissension within global Christianity, and the recognition of historical development and doctrinal change. In my book, I argue that Newman uses the word principle to describe what Lewis calls myth, referring to the universal truth or religious essence that binds all people together, regardless of their location in history. And here I would argue that Bultmann's term for this is kerygma, and Karl Barth's term is revelation. They're all saying the same thing. Lewis expressly presents himself in Mere Christianity as simply relaying the facts of the Christian faith. But that is a clever move that allows him to avoid taking responsibility for his choice of what to highlight as the myth or essence of Christianity. His self-presentation aside, Mere Christianity belongs alongside Harnack's The Essence of Christianity, translated as What is Christianity, as a carefully crafted selection of what Lewis finds meaningful in Christian teaching, which picks certain doctrines while discarding others. The modern character of Lewis's project goes deeper still. Like Newman, and even someone as modern as Friedrich Schleiermacher, Lewis has a theory of religion in general that forms the genus within which the essence of Christianity is the species. In his 1946 essay, Religion Without Dogma, Lewis refuses to define the essence of religion as belief in God and immortality, since that would exclude Judaism and Buddhism, he says. He instead proposes that the essence of religion, that's his term, the essence of religion is the thirst for an end higher than natural ends, a self-rejection that will turn out also to be a self-finding. I take it I do not need to explain to this audience how thoroughly modern such a definition is. Unfortunately, that seems to have been lost on Lewis himself. Despite the manifest similarities between his project and his theological contemporaries, Lewis repeatedly insists that there is no change, that all things religious stay the same. He makes that point most clearly in his 1943 essay, Dogma and the Universe, where he concludes with the following: when any man comes into the presence of God, he will find, whether he wishes it or not, that all things which seem to make him so different from men of other times or even from his earlier self, have fallen off him. He is back where he always was, where every man always is. Eadem Sunt Omnia Semper. The Latin phrase here can be translated literally as all things are always the same. It comes from Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, specifically from the Speech of Nature in Book 3. The context for this passage is rather interesting. In this speech, nature is addressing a representative human being who is anxious about death. Nature begins by commending those who are grateful for the good things that they've enjoyed in life and who remember the gifts they've received. Nature then scolds those who only complain about how wretched life is and see no reason to continue living. Those people, nature suggests, should simply bring their life to an end. And here comes the key phrase, all things are the same. Or in the classic Humphreys translation, it's the same old story always. Notice then that this phrase appears in the context of nature describing the wrong attitude about the world. While in a sense it is true that things remain the same, this is an impoverished perspective on life, one that focuses on the mundane repetition of misery rather than on the surprising and unexpected gifts of wonder and joy. To be sure, Lewis is not trying to convey Lucretius's philosophy in this one quote, though I cannot help but point out that Lewis seems to read Lucretius the same way he reads the Bible, pulling choice quotes out of context and then using them for his own ends without regard for their historical location. Be that as it may, it seems to me Lucretius's message is worth translating into the context of religion. How dreadfully miserable it would be if Lewis were right to say that in the presence of God, all people are always in the same position, always in a timeless moment with no change, nothing new, nothing surprising. One is reminded of Thomas Aquinas' utterly bloodless conception of eternity as an eternal stasis with no movement, no passion, no life. Thankfully, Lewis himself and his writings convey quite a different vision of what life before God and before others is like. He is, as Leslie points out beautifully, far better in his stories than in his essays and nonfiction. In his effort to prove that he is a dinosaur, that's his own term, a remnant of the old Western culture, he backs himself into a truly disastrous corner. Lewis, however, is not a walking fossil, but a truly modern man, speaking and teaching and writing to people in the modern world, and we are all the better for it. My thanks and congratulations to Leslie for her wonderful book.